Lucas had wanted to have ILM up in the San Francisco area in the first place. So after work on Star Wars was finished, plans were put forward to move it up to the Bay Area. The original crew was divided. Everyone was off doing their own projects, of course, but when Lucas was looking to restaff ILM, Dykstra was convincing people that they didn't have to move up to San Francisco. They could work with him to make their own special effects company work. But Jim Johnston, Ralph McQuarrie, Dennis Muren, Richard Enland, Lorne Peterson, Phil Tippett, and Ken Ralston all made the move to ILM and their brand new building. One important addition that Muren told Lucas they had to have was an area specifically set aside for stop motion. There had been a limited amount of that in the original film, but Muren said that with the Walker sequence that would be so vital to the action of the film's first act, having an area set aside specifically for stop motion animation would be vital to prevent them from falling behind throughout production. This proved to be an invaluable insight, because they were behind before they even finished getting set up in their new facility. Many were left to deconstruct and bring up the equipment themselves for installation, meaning that, while they had tested equipment this time, they were rebuilding much like the way much of Star Wars had been building. Phil Tippett leapt into action with the first of the stop-motion work, that of the Tauntauns for the effects shots. He took the designs that McQuarrie and Johnston had come up with and revised it further to create a creature he felt he could work with. Shooting was then another challenge because at this stage, all they had to work with in this new department was one of the old Dykstraflex, rather than the more advanced equipment that had been developed since the completion of Star Wars. They had 2 years to complete the special effects for the film. Now that sounds like a long time, especially with so much accomplished creating the original film. But the fact was that rebuilding ILM near San Francisco was introducing a large number of complications. The facility was effectively just an empty warehouse when they arrived. There wasn't even electricity when they first moved in. The heating was woefully insufficient, and the speed needed for development was often exceeding the red tape that was obstructing them. In fact, at one point, time demanded completion of a workspace to move on with production before they could get the permit to set it up. So you could imagine their terror when they learned the building inspector was coming the very next day. In order to deal with it, the crew that was on hand spent the entire night constructing a fake wall and decorating it so that the offending area would be overlooked. In that environment, Tippett wasn't even able to work on the model yet. His first test for the Tauntaun actually involved a leftover creature that he had used for the film Piranha, in order to ensure that they could use the equipment of the actual models once they were ready. Stop motion was one of the oldest disciplines in Hollywood, but things had evolved over the decades since King Kong had amazed audiences, and the Tauntaun was a good choice of where to work out the kinks in their system before they moved on to the more challenging aspect, which was the Imperial War Machine. In keeping with the theme that the Empire was the United States and the rebels Vietnam, Lucas envisioned a large and excessively complicated invasion force, and while a number of approaches were taken, ultimately, inspiration was taken from an advertisement of a truck with legs that led to the creation of the Walker. It actually would fit rather well with the goal Lucas had, as they would be large and powerful and seemingly unstoppable, shown through direct standard military attacks. It was unconventional low-tech ideas that would easily vanquish them, tangling up their legs or penetrating the undefended underbelly and throwing explosives inside that would demonstrate just how fallible they were. But the real advantage was that stop motion would work perfectly for this kind of an invader, because the robotic appearance that stop motion can sometimes give would emphasize the inhuman nature of these invaders. John Berg is credited with turning the rough sketches into the iconic vehicular monsters seen during the invasion. Berg's arrival seemed a bit like an invasion in itself. He was a giant of a man with cowboy boots, black leather vest, and the hair and beard of a Hell's Angel. The last thing that those who hadn't met him would have thought was that this was a master of handling tiny, delicate machinery. And yet he created his Walker model so that all the person manipulating it needed to do was move the limb, and all of the pieces would adjust as if there were mechanisms moving the limb instead. A way to add to the realism of these fantastic machines without increasing the complexity of the work required in order to film it. Now, that was important because Lucas was concerned about the company growing too large. By 1979, Lucasfilm had already grown to 350 employees, and Lucas was becoming concerned that it was all going to go beyond his control. Nevertheless, with ILM in the Bay Area now, it became something of a hobby for Lucas himself. This was a man who owned a multi-million-dollar corporate empire and trained in the art of cinema, yet showing up to literally pick up a hammer and help build new walls for the facility. He was able to keep a closer eye on ILM since he wasn't directly involved in the filming of The Empire Strikes Back, and it was just minutes away from his home. And Lucas was actually quite proud of what the little company had been able to do. All of the big Hollywood studios had closed their effects departments decades earlier, but his company was now on the cutting edge and working to go even further. Richard Edlund actually went out and spoke to as many of the veterans of the classic age as he could to learn how to take their tried and true methods and marry it to their advanced technology, and pouring through books on optics to discover ways to overcome their challenges. While other special effects films such as Meteor and Star Trek the Motion Picture were running into issues related to special effects, ILM was struggling to prove that Star Wars was not a fluke, but a new standard. And Lucas's personal interest in ILM actually made complete sense, considering that his original film passion lay in cameras. And what ILM was doing with cameras in order to achieve these results was fascinating, taking up previously discarded cameras and combining it with state-of-the-art technology. Lucas often had talked about making these small personal films that he always wanted. Yet it seemed that ILM was in reality far closer to where his passions in filmmaking lay. It's no surprise that he signed off on a prototype $500,000 optic printer that Edlund proposed based on, in part, on submarine periscope technology, but something that should be capable of achieving what many thought was going to be impossible: blue screen with a white surface. With the film over budget, expenses at ILM were being criticized as much as those on the set. And yet, what was being ignored and downplayed was the fact that, while things were proving more expensive on both those fronts, that was where it was needed for this kind of film, especially given the obstacles that had been run into, such as the original Millennium Falcon being destroyed by the elements and requiring a complete reconstruction, and the fact that Lucas had specifically chosen to bring ILM up to the Bay as opposed to keeping it where it had been. These were all necessary things. But there were other things going on too that were not necessary in order to make a second Star Wars movie. A lot of it because Lucasfilm was now a bloated corporate empire in its own right, with executives that had huge salaries and benefits, and with more people below them than what was necessary, because that's another means of measuring success in Hollywood, where much of the corporate side of Lucasfilm was still being handled. While Kurtz, Kirshner, and ILM management are criticized, at least they were trying to make a good film. And when you're talking about people facing 18-hour days in extreme weather situations, or working in a facility with insufficient lighting and heating during the winter and having to put in unpaid overtime, it's hard to accept that the blame falls in their direction as opposed to people putting in 40-hour weeks in a job so cushy that even their secretaries get BMWs. And in the end, it wasn't corporate executives, lawyers, assistants, or anyone else that the public was interested in. It was the adventures happening in a galaxy far, far away. And when The Empire Strikes Back finally hit theaters, critics and audiences alike were once again singing the praises of the Star Wars franchise. The Empire Strikes Back became the highest grossing sequel of all time, earning more than $200 million. And keep in mind that in May 1980, when this film was released, the United States was in the middle of a recession, and Empire was still breaking records. And while there were some who felt the film was just a shadow of the original, for the most part, critics were impressed at the new direction of the series and the much greater focus on character this time around. It has been argued that Empire is responsible for sequels being darker than the first film of a series because of just how successful its tone is in making the story work. And as for the promise made to Kirshner that he can make a better film, time seems to have decided that he did. Roger Ebert declared it to be the best film in the series. It made Playboy's lists of sequels better than the original. And Empire magazine, when it asked 10,000 film fans to vote on their favorite movies, The Empire Strikes Back came in third. The original Star Wars did not even break the top 20. It may have been difficult. It may have been costly. It may have been stressful. But it was definitely a greater success than anyone at Lucasfilm could have possibly dreamed. And given that the entire future of Star Wars was depending upon Empire proving that Star Wars was not just another 70s fad, but an adventure that audiences still craved, the benefits of its success were beyond measure. Thanks to Empire, there was a future for Lucasfilm, for ILM, for Star Wars 3, and for Lucas's dream of Skywalker Ranch, with its beautiful stained glass dome.